Hello, everybody. I'm so excited to be speaking with you today because I came across an article in The Hill by wonderkin Jacob Hornstein, who's actually in the class of 2028 at UATX, the new renegade university. And he made this really key argument that I think is underrated in the world of pronatalism. The title of the article, JD Vance, Elon Musk are right about falling birth rates, but here's where they get it all wrong. What do you think is his point? Where do you think
Well,
he
you've told me about this already. He thinks it's genetics and that it will be washed out, and he's just super wrong and not good at math. But continue, Simone.
I think it's an important conversation to be had because he makes some valid points and he points to some valid information, but he is missing some very important details. So he starts the article with their efforts are notable, but Vance and Musk both underappreciate the role of genetics in determining fertility. Without a proper understanding, their efforts will fail. Now, I think both Vance and Musk are really up to date on genetics. First, he points to the research of Ronald Fisher, and this is where I learned something new because I didn't realize that this concept that fertility is heritable goes back to as early of the 1930s. So in 1930, this guy named Ronald Fisher wrote a book called The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection. And I love genetical as a word. Can we bring that back?
Yes.
In which he talks about the correlation between genetics and fertility. From the article, Jacob writes, Fisher noted that the granddaughters of large families tended to have more children than those from small families. Fisher concluded that, quote, about 40% of the total variance, end quote, in fertility was attributable to genetics. He continues, importantly, Fisher didn't just conclude that fertility varied between individuals because of different genetic abilities to have children. Instead, Fisher argued that the most important cause of variation was different genetic desire to have children. Fisher theorized that more fertile strains with a greater desire for children could become more common within a span of 10 generations or approximately 250 years. So immediately, this is where the argument both is legitimate but incredibly flawed, and you see where the flaw is, right?
Well, no, the flaw is not where you think it is.
Okay.
You think the flaw is, let me see if I'm getting you right here. You think the flaw is around timelines for impact.
Sort of.
What do you think the flaw is?
Well, we don't have 250 years to bounce back from
Okay,
the vertiginous
so it's
drop in
timelines for
fertility.
impact. That's not sort of. I was exactly right.
Oh, I thought you meant like that it was
Okay,
gonna
but
take a
here's
long.
here's what it gets wrong.
Okay.
It literally doesn't understand evolution at the most base level.
Okay. Go
So
on.
all right, let's see if I can condense the point I tried to make while talking, but ended up being very long. Pointing out that fertility is heritable in humans, or that people who have higher rates of fertility end up having kids who have more kids, is not the same as pointing out something like blue eyes are heritable and people with blue eyes end up having more kids, because fertility is a near direct correlate or marker for fitness within modern human populations where people aren't dying of diseases or from lack of food. Now, the very fact that we're seeing significant genetic variation and fertility related behaviors within a population isn't evidence that one variant is strictly quote unquote better in evolutionary terms. If it were consistently advantageous across environments, it would have been optimized through selection. Instead, this variation signals that the environmental pressures are changing, creating different selection conditions that temporarily favor certain genetic predispositions before changing again as society evolves. E.g., the very fact that in this initial study, he found that some women had these genetic precursors to predilections for having lots of kids, and other women didn't have that, meant that there must not have been this strong selective pressure that he was observing in his own time if you went back 150 years before his own time, or that one behavior pattern would have already been selected for. So an example we can look at here is if you look at the distant past and food was scarce and there wasn't modern medicine, there would have been an evolutionary benefit for a woman not being overly impulsive in who she was sleeping with and ending up having too many kids. Whereas there would have been pretty much a strict evolutionary benefit during a period where you have modern medicine and modern food to this level of impulsivity that might lead to tons of kids. But then this benefit may disappear when contraception comes onto the scene and evolutionary strategies that relied on impulsivity suddenly stop working. So you can see as the environment changes, the psychological correlates to high fertility also change. And right now we're dealing in a time where the evolutionary environment is completely doing somersaults every few years, if not at least every couple decades. I mean,
Yeah.
evolution has been acting throughout this entire period. It didn't start in the 1930s, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so what he's noticing here is in the 1930s, certain genetic predilections, or I'd say certain personality predilections that had genetic correlates led to a higher fertility rate then than they would have in the past and are now being strongly selected for. But here's the problem with all of that. The personality profile or predilections that differentially led to a high fertility rate in the 1930s versus, let's say, just 100 years before that
Hmm.
are radically different than the ones that lead to a high number of children today.
That's a really
Uh,
good point. I hadn't even thought about that because we live in such a different landscape with so many different pressures.
right. And
Like
so
if it was conformist and cool to have kids back then you're the last person to have kids now.
exactly. As we've pointed out, actually, society within this generation, and this is the primary thing I would argue that's leading to fertility collapse. Because if you look in Latin America, you look at the United States, it's mostly women under 24 who are not having kids. Within all the other demographics, fertility rates are going up or staying even, which
Mhm.
implies that it's the accidental children that were being had due to people who had a personality profile for maybe more reckless decisions, maybe higher amounts of arousal or lust, maybe higher amounts of not thinking through things or impulsivity. And that strategy for motivating reproduction in the world, both in Latin America, because that's also where we see it disappearing, and in the United States, is no longer successful. And
Yeah.
this transformation has only happened in about the past 6 years or so. So I think the problem is that if
Well,
you're
I mean, so many things are happening, right? I mean, we've seen various demographic transitions take place, and I think they're in response to really complicated things. And this is why Dan
no,
has
no,
his.
Simone, the primary cause of demographic collapse right now that's happened very recently, that's led to this recent collapse, isn't complicated. It's not a bunch of things. It's one thing that has disappeared that used to exist within the population. And it
What?
is entirely a genetically coded personality profile strategy for motivating fertility rate, which stopped being functional. This is incredibly important if you're trying to chart out long term what's going to be selected for when we consider how quickly the genetically correlated personality profiles that are evolutionarily successful change with the change in technology. Sorry, to answer her what question, because I didn't hear it while this was recording. The thing that has disappeared from the population are the children who were born by accident. That's the vast majority, i.e., the parents were horny and made an impulsive decision and ended up getting pregnant without intending to end up getting pregnant. That is the category of birth that has dropped most precipitously if we assume that this category made up most of the births in the United States under the age of 24 and even more under the age of 18, which I think is a pretty safe assumption because those are the two categories where fertility rates have actually dropped, and yet we see stable or rising fertility rates for women of all other age brackets. And this was the strategy that was both cultural and culturally evolutionarily selected for historically and biologically evolutionarily selected for, where if you paired an impulsive high arousal person with a cultural group that banned access to things like pornography and contraception, that individual is going to have more kids. This strategy just doesn't appear to be very effective anymore, with most kids being born because parents intentionally chose to have those kids even when they're from cultures that historically leaned on accidental pregnancies to pad their populations. By that, what I mean, Simone, is if we've already seen this radical shift just over the past 10 years or so, we are going to potentially see a completely different personality profile relevant in the next 20 years. And then 20 years after that, it'll be a completely different profile, which doesn't give evolution enough time to optimize around that.
So you're kind of saying that given the rapidly shifting environment, any sort of genetic predisposition to have kids is irrelevant because whatever works today isn't going to work in 20 years and isn't going to work in 40.
Yeah, because it's very important to note that it is not a genetic predisposition to have kids. Okay. What
Hmm.
it is things like a genetic predisposition for impulsive decisions or a genetic predisposition to act on lust in the past. And
Hmm.
for our generation, it is likely a genetic predisposition to be very goal directed, to
Yeah.
be a long term thinker, to
Yeah.
be, in fact,
Be
all of the
less hedonic, more conscientious, more long-term
anti-hedonic,
oriented.
more conscientious,
Yeah.
more I'd say very like if you look at why are we high fertility? Why is everyone from my family high fertility? Like across my family,
Hmm.
it's a very I'm from a very high fertility family. None of these are kids that were had accidentally. Not a single person in my family that I'm ever aware of had gotten pregnant accidentally. Everyone in my family is very dedicated to like these are kids that exist because they got married and they wanted kids. But then secondarily, if you look at like my personality profile, the genetically coded trait I have within my personality profile that I think is most linked to me having a lot of kids is the trait that caused me when I knew that my college degree was about to end, I already like couldn't focus on it. I was already focused on moving into the next city, getting a job, starting that job early. This was true like when I went to college, I arrived a week early and I took a map and I made a map of every important location in the
Oh
city
my
so I could be
gosh.
as effective as possible in that first week. When we first got married, I was like, okay, Simone, we need to start thinking about having kids. Like, when is that going to happen? Like, we need to start looking at this, and this. When I met you, I was like, Simone, I am so late to get married. I should have gotten married in college. I think it's two things overlapping. One, this intense initiative drive that I have, which isn't like a regular initiative. It's like a plan out, get to the next stage sort of initiative.
Mhm.
And then the second is, and this is why we're always like starting new companies or new projects or anything like that. Like it can have deleterious effects as well, but we mostly complete those as well. So I guess that's not terrible. Like I mean, look at the Collins Institute. But the second trait that I have is an obsession with planning. Not just a I need to do this right now, but the other is and I need to collect all of the data on this thing. Like she knows like
Well,
when I
but
buy a car.
that also is like the famous trait highlighted at the very beginning of the movie Idiocracy, implying this is why people stopped having kids because they were planning. And in fact, that is one of the same factors that is associated with the steepest drop in fertility. It's that people do now want to plan their children and not have mistake babies. And so now they're using birth control diligently. Now
Actually,
they're
this is
planning to have
this
kids
is
later.
psychologically an interesting question. There is obviously, and you know what I mean when I'm talking about the way that I plan things, a
Mhm.
psychological difference between me and like the planning procrastinator. What do you think that
Yeah, you're
psychological
actually,
difference
I would
is?
say that you're not a planner. You are a figure out what's wrong and fix it while you're doing it person. You're not actually a
No,
planner.
no,
I don't
no.
think.
Okay, actually, hold on. I'll word this differently because I am a planner, but it's a different. So these people are about to make a major life decision, and so they go into that major life decision and they say, "Okay, what's everything I need to know about this major life decision?" Whereas the type of planning that I do is I have X goal for myself, have a lot of kids.
Mhm.
Okay, while I'm 17, I need to look up all of the biological things that could get in the way of that. I need to look up all of the things that could get in the way of that. I think it's that I have a compulsion to plan out super long-term things. I mean, is
Mhm.
that not what my interest in the pronatalist movement is, right?
Mhm.
That I work back from a end desire with a lot of meticulousness.
Well, and I think that big characteristic is long-termism of people having kids now, and also
Mm.
comfort with delayed gratification. That is crucial. But yeah, planning, I would just reword that, you
But
know.
but before we go, the point being is that these things may continue to be high fertility in the age of AI, but we don't know. Like AI might be able
Uh-huh.
to augment some of these things, like a person not thinking through that they're not going to be fertile if they wait until their late 20s to find a husband or wife.
Yeah, or it could just, seamlessly help them make, it can enable viable in vitro
Well,
gametogenesis.
just
So you don't
consider
need to plan.
a really good point you just made there is just consider if medical technology increases the window, which it likely will, that a woman can get pregnant so that she can get pregnant significantly later, you have
Mm,
entirely changed the personality profile, the genetically linked personality profile that's optimal for having lots of kids. But
yeah.
anyway, back to the article.
Yeah, so I'm assuming so after he talks about Fisher in the 1930s, and it's still wild to me that people thought that high birth rate was genetical so early. He talks about how, quote, twin studies from the US and Britain, Denmark, and Sweden have shown that as much as 50% of variation in fertility is genetically derived, supporting Fisher's earlier estimate. DNA sequencing has supported this, highlighting individual genes that are strongly associated with fertility. He continues that similarly, studies from Denmark and Quebec have shown that the role of genetics in determining fertility has increased in Western populations, supporting the idea of ongoing selection for the desire to have children. Genes have been identified that correlate with earlier age at first birth, later age at last birth, and total children ever born, and later menopause. So you think none of those matter? I mean, I imagine
The
that.
menopause, no, it's the question here is not are certain things being selected for within this generation,
Mhm.
but could those things reach an optimum level and then lead to fertility rates increasing again society-wide?
Yeah.
These are two very different questions. Do I doubt? No, not at all that things are being selected for within this generation. I am also not somebody who doubts incredibly fast changes in human profiles, whether it
Yeah.
is
Based
biology
on
or psychology.
someone
If
at choke point, yeah, can
yeah,
really
so
quickly
for
change
example,
things.
if it turned out that there was something within our generation that basically ensured that nobody who had a high degree of impulsivity was having kids, you would see a rapid and profound shift in the amount of impulsivity in just one generation. The problem being is the technological shift. So around things like menopause, you could say, okay, well, like later menopause is going to be selected for, right?
Yeah.
But that'll likely take, because it's not being selected for that strongly within this generation, at least 4 generations to really be felt. With that being the case, in 4 generations, do I expect most babies, like, do I expect them to be able to medically increase the lengths of menopause? Do I
Well,
expect
and
them
keep
to
in
be
mind, Fisher's theory was 10 generations or 250 years. So, I
Yeah, yeah,
mean,
yeah. So the point I'm making is this stuff is going to be relevant in the developing world, but I do not think it'll be as relevant to the developed world or the portion of humanity that's like aiming for the stars and everything like that. And I would note that what you're actually seeing here and
mm,
what's really being sort of missed in the way this is being framed is that
mhm.
within different social and economic contexts, different genes are going to be high fertility because they are associated with different fertility strategies. So, for example,
Mm.
in the developing world, we might see more of a selection for impulsivity again, especially in areas of extreme poverty. You might see an increase in the rate of twin carrying. You might see an increase in the rate of extended menopause. For example, one of the genetic changes in the game that I'm writing that takes place in a post-fertility apocalypse world, a faction of humanity, it went for this dysgenic strategy, this strategy of low
Mm.
impulse control, low education, everything like that. And
Yay.
in that community, because they're not going to be as augmented by technology as much, you're going to see the most genetic change. And one of the genetic changes that I presume will happen within this community is they'll begin to give birth litters with smaller brain
Litters.
cases. Yeah, the primary thing that prevents this in humans and why you don't have twins that much in humans is it lowers the IQ of each of them. And then you've got the risk to the female of the giant brain case, which right now it's just like a huge problem for any population that isn't wealthy and has access to technology because women die from that all the time. You're like,
Babies' heads getting stuck.
yes. Well, you couldn't give birth to kids. It's not just IVF. You also, our kids' heads are too big for you to give birth naturally. Like,
Yeah.
we need to maintain technology for our gene line to survive. And that's a
Women with
completely
giant heads.
different evolutionary strategy. And I think that we haven't seen a speciation or potential split in humans for a long time with these very, very differentiated selected strategies.
Fair point.
Okay, continue.
So I'm curious to see then what you think of his reference to France as a real world example. Jacob writes, in Europe, France was the first nation to experience significant modern birth rate declines. Yet today, France has the highest birth rate in all of Europe. And just to confirm, yes, it does. France's total fertility rate is now 1.79 live births per woman, at least as of 2022. This places it ahead of other European Union countries, followed by Romania, 1.71, and Bulgaria, 1.65. So, correct. He writes, France's high fertility can't be explained by immigration. Regions with few immigrants lead the country in fertility. Culture, French-speaking areas of neighboring Belgium and Switzerland don't have elevated fertility. Or policy, France is below the OECD average for family aid. But it may be explainable through genetics. France's fertility transition occurred in the 1750s, matching Fisher's calculation that it would take approximately 10 generations for genetic shifts to substantially increase birth rates. Now, I'm a very credulous person, so I read something like that and I'm like, oh, I guess it's the genetics.
So he is actually right about this, but not in a way that helps his overall argument.
Okay.
So the timelines line up. If you're familiar with the history of the region, France had a fertility crash before most of the other regions in Europe because it secularized before most of the other regions in Europe. The fertility crash in France aligned with the secularization. So what do we have here in France in the 1700s when we're talking about this initial fertility collapse? What you had was, remember how I said it is not that you have high birth rate genes or high fertility genes. It's that you have high fertility genes within a specific social context. What happened to France is they went from a social context where the genes needed to motivate high fertility in a very religious society to genes that needed to motivate high fertility in an irreligious society. And those two genes were different, which led to a fertility crash. Since then, the genes that lead to or protect fertility rates despite irreligiosity have been selected for in France. Now, we can ask, what are those genes? It could be interesting to study. I mean, clearly there's a strategy here. Is it that they are really focused on long-term planning, like the thing that causes my family to be high fertility? Or is it that they are really focused on like high impulsivity? And my family is high impulsivity as well. I guess I'd say it's like a long-term planning plus impulsivity. Do like what collection is it that works? And then we have to ask the second question is
hold
that
on, that you answered that first question. Remember the first thing that you chose to look at when our foundation started looking at demographic collapse of like, should we be concerned about this? Was you took data collected by Spencer Greenberg, which he collected after the 2016 presidential election in the United States, which also happened to collect information on how many kids participants had. And you looked for, with the help of someone from, I think, the Mayo Clinic or something that we hired, for correlations in behavioral traits or beliefs or general characteristics between high fertility and these people. So what did you find, Malcolm?
Well, high degrees of xenophobia lead to higher fertility rates. High degrees of authoritarian thinking lead to higher fertility rates. Those are the two core things. Religiosity was much lower on it than I expected.
It was men. It was going to be religiosity, and it turned out no, it's about outgroup hatred and xenophobia. Oh, and very like sensitivity to hierarchy.
but keep in mind, this is one particular genetic strategy.
Yeah.
And so
but I'm just saying, like, that's the one that appears to be doing well.
But we don't know what it was that was selected for between 1700s France and modern day France. But what I can say is that whatever the change in the genetic profile between pre-1700s France, religious France and secular France, yes, it may have adopted to a secular society now. The problem is that the new things that are impacting fertility rate and impacting it incrementally more each generation now, specifically here, we're looking at like AI boyfriends and girlfriends, really difficult dating markets. Like these are two, like when I'm looking at like actually what are the biggest fertility challenges our kids need to overcome, for you and me within our generation, it was overcoming the hedonism that was all around us and a society that
it was even more. I think it was having the discipline to date, find, and marry a partner.
No. It was, well, yeah, it was about having discipline, but also the will to go against what society was telling us.
Uh,
Now, for our kids, the key hurdles are actually quite different. Winning within the modern dating market requires a completely different set of sociological profiles than was necessary to win in our generation.
Not I think less so for me. I think that women can still have a huge advantage by being a first mover, by like actively and proactively reaching out to men and engaging with them, because women still just don't do that.
So women, okay, this is a great point. I do not think that women being first movers is what was selected for between religious France and secular
Mm,
France.
that's a really
Um,
good that's a really good
this is
point.
a this is an entirely new genetic strategy that
Yeah,
became relevant, and I think it is super relevant for this generation. I think
extremely.
young women born in this generation who are sexually aggressive first movers are going to be dramatically more reproductively successful than their counterparts. Yet I do
Yeah.
not think that this is like a
Well,
long-term
sexually
optimum
aggressive first movers and closers. Let's be
and
clear about
closers.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Not like sleep around with a lot of people, but like they choose their target and they
They're on it. Yeah.
yeah, okay. So I yeah, that's my thought. And I think he's pointing to a real phenomenon here that there was actually a genetic selection, a genetic change in France after this period, but it was a one-off thing that was really only allowed by a fairly stable change in society that lasted for like 100 years, which is not what we're dealing with now. I'd
Yeah.
also point out that we can see, if we're talking about, remember I said it's about having a genetic optimum for a specific society and set of social rules and norms.
Mhm.
This is, as we have mentioned many times, why I think that previously Catholic populations, now France doesn't really count here because again, they secularized really early, but if you're talking about your
Well,
average
but
Catholic
I mean,
majority
I think
European
what he's
country,
describing here is rural French speaking, genetically, like historically French.
but with
People.
France, the thing that led to the population collapse was secularization. So we can ignore France in this part of the conversation, Simone. So specifically here, if you're looking at Catholic populations, I always point out they have a much lower, like historically, genetically Catholic populations, i.e., populations where you had a strongly held Catholic belief system alongside genes, and different genes are going to be successful in this environment, right? Because
Mhm.
a population that bans things like pornography and contraception and stuff like that is going to cause specific genes to be more successful, specifically genes around like low impulsivity control, high arousal, everything like that. This is particularly compounded in something like Catholic culture, where you have that line, Matthew 19:6, which states, "What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." Basically, it means that if you as a young person sleep around and get knocked up, it's shotgun wedding time. That's who you're going to marry. So that impulsivity doesn't leave you out of the sex market. In other cultures, a woman who sleeps around and gets knocked up while she's young basically becomes unmarriable for the rest of her life and is stuck in poverty with that one kid, which makes impulsivity a very bad evolutionary strategy for that population. As an aside here, I denote that the stereotype of the Catholic schoolgirl being extra horny and sleeping around a lot, and the takeaway lesson from this, that this is because if you repress someone or you don't give them access to sexual outlets, they end up acting in this way, may actually be wrong. It may just be that Catholics have been intergenerationally selected for high horniness when contrasted with other religious groups, because that had a higher impact on their fertility than other religious groups. And as somebody who's slept around a lot, I can say anecdotally, and I've mentioned this before, Catholic girls are just way hornier than any other group of girls who I slept with, and way more engaged in bed than any other group that I've slept with. And this would make sense because those traits would have led to differential higher fertility given Catholic culture within Catholic populations, and thus been selected for.
Fuck me. I like your shiny hair.
Hello, children.
Hello, Father.
Please, call me Peter.
Christ.
Think of me as a friend. Look. Just like you now. Dose.
And that now that this strategy no longer works or is no longer like socially enforced enough to be successful, we are seeing populations that leaned on it have a unique crash in fertility rates, specifically the Latin American fertility crash and the Catholic majority European country fertility crash, which is much lower than the rest of Europe.
Fair. I want to hear what you think of Jacob's recommendations, because I agree with half of what he says, and the other half I'm like, you're totally misreading things. He writes, first, one-size-fits-all proposals to raise birth rates while ignoring genetics won't work. Vance has argued for increasing the child tax credit, while Musk has called for giving medals to increase the social status of motherhood. But as we've seen in Hungary and Norway, which both generously subsidize birth, solutions that focus on extrinsic motivations are ineffective at raising fertility. Instead, policies to counter population decline will be most effective if they consider genetics by subsidizing those with demonstrated fertility desires. For example, governments should offer increased tax credits to larger families rather than by evenly distributing incentives per child. He also argues that we'll just naturally rebound, which I would totally disagree with.
That's actually like, okay, so this person sounds like an otherwise smart person. This natural rebound idea is just so preposterous. We are looking at the timelines we're looking at here and the speed of the crash.
Yeah.
This is somebody who like, well, I think
like we never argued there wasn't going to be a rebound. We just knew that the rebound would be into a post-apocalyptic,
post-civilization. Yeah, the rebounds happens post-apocalyptic, post-speciation, a lot of other really big things. Like, yeah, you get a rebound, but after, like, you don't just be like, this is like saying, oh yeah, our car is heading towards a cliff, but don't worry, eventually, you know, it'll be made into a new car. And you're like, wait, what do you mean it'll be made into a new car? It's like, you know, a lot of cars, after they get wrecked, they get sent to the impound and they get crushed like in Brave Little Toaster.
And there ain't nothing you can do about it. Pardon me while I panic!
Don't have the heart to live in the fast lane. All that is past and gone.
And then they get moved to the new car. And it's like, whoa. So you're basically saying, I have a car now. There will be a car at some point in the future. And you are ignoring that entire musical scene in Brave Little Toaster, which is happening in between those two scenes.
I took the kids on the skids with the hope he was happy till I heard him say, you're worthless.
No, it's just like those evil person trope in a movie when he's like, yes, tell me the secret and I will set you free. And then, you know, they say whatever it is and then they shoot them in the head and they're like, from your mortal coil. It's like, yeah, we'll get through this.
Yeah.
I mean,
after society has completely collapsed, sure.
There will be nothing left, but whatever. But what I do appreciate, where he does get it right though, is he basically roughly says that the important thing is to protect already high fertility population. That is 100% the most important thing to do.
No, he said you need to take into account the different genetics of populations that are having lots of kids. And here I would argue he is absolutely right, but he's not being specific. And he needs to be specific here because when you get specific, it gets offensive, but it's important. Okay?
Okay, so you have to say, what are the offensive parts of this?
Well, some genetically selected reproductive strategies are based around parasitizing the state, for example. There are certain like personality profiles that have some genetic correlates to them, which would lead to, one, choosing to live off the state at a higher rate, and two, using that to have lots of kids. If we as a state lean into solutions that target this genetic strategy, that's going to make everything worse for everyone. if we alternatively look around and say, okay, what other strategies are there right here now? Okay, let's look at the Quiverfull strategy, right? The Quiverfull strategy is very different from your and mine strategy, okay? This is a religious family who has a stay-at-home mom and who is biologically with natural sex, just having sex a lot and hoping that she gets pregnant a bunch of times. So what's going to be selected for in a family that's
No,
doing that?
it's letting Jesus take the wheel with
Yeah, letting Jesus take the wheel. So a family that's doing that intergenerationally, okay, what is going to lead to a higher number of kids? You're likely going to get, this is where I think authoritarianism is being selected for, because families will stay together longer if there is a tendency to trust like the authority of the family, even when he might be going against things, and also trusting God. I think that that's part of what we're seeing there, not religiosity, but just like I obey the authority. And then secondarily, I think that they're going to do better if they have higher degrees of female submissiveness and preference for traditional feminine roles, as we've seen that those do have a genetic link, that those preferences.
I love the slip there, because both traditional feminine roles and traditional fremen roles both work here.
Feminine roles, yes. Also, you're gonna get later menopause selection. You're going to get a higher degree of ability to get pregnant, like fecundity, like actual biological fecundity, which is just completely irrelevant for Simone and I, because we use like IVF, and people are like, oh, humans
Well, and
can't.
factors like health span broadly, like health, do I think matter, because that influences
Well,
how
actually,
long you can
I'm not
biologically
arguing
have your
you're
own.
kind of, but people who are like, oh, with you guys, you cannot intergenerationally use a technology like IVF so much that it affects your genes so that you're reliant on the technology, to
Mm,
which I would point them to C-sections, where this has
yeah.
already happened to a huge portion of the developed world, where they now have kids whose craniums are so large on average that they would just die. Like, if we lost the technology for C-sections as a society and we attempted to just survive naturally, and this is something that's like not described in like post-apocalyptic novels or stuff like that, we
Mm.
probably have, I think, about 25 to 30% of women die before they got to 3 kids. Like, we have
Well, isn't that more or less what happened in the past?
no. You couldn't
That
possibly survive as a species if you couldn't get to 3
yeah, if
kids
you get
on average biologically. No,
um,
biologically, if you could not get to 3 kids, because not everyone is reproductively
yeah,
successful.
that's true. That's true. That's true. That's true.
So this is a new thing, and it's the same with
Mm.
IVF and stuff like that. The point that I'm making here is the Quiverfull reproductive strategy and our reproductive strategies are 2 different but symbiotic and economically productive reproductive strategies
Yeah.
that lead to groups that bring America forward. And so I think that government policies that recognize, Quiverfull, this is a beneficial reproductive strategy for the state. It is okay to look for ways to promote this reproductive strategy. For example, preventing their kids from being brainwashed and everything like that.
Yeah.
Maybe helping lower types of fertility technology cost that these types of families use, like those fertility technologies that like Catholics like to use for getting pregnant naturally at a higher rate and stuff like that, and increase training around those types of technology within our school system. I'd promote all of that, even though it doesn't benefit my reproductive strategy. It benefits one of the I don't know how to say it, non-parasitic reproductive strategies, and I would hope that they would have the magnanimity to also promote technology that helps our reproductive strategy, as Trump and JD Vance have already done with their signing into an executive order reducing the cost of IVF.
That was more just calling for advice on policy that would make IVF more affordable for people.
Their goal was to reduce the price of IVF.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yes, an executive order with the goal to do that.
And I'd also point out, with this executive order, somebody on the Discord was saying the only thing they care about and their big fear is that the possibility for IVF would be banned. And they're like, Malcolm, like, seriously, can we trust that Trump's not going to do that? And I think we can see now, no, he's not going to do that.
Yeah.
He's literally
IVF
lowering
is
the
very
cost.
safe. Hey, come on, he's like called himself the father of IVF. I don't think he's gonna go back.
Well,
on
especially
that.
with Elon around, but
I would be surprised if Trump did not have any children through IVF. So
yeah,
I think once you go through it, you are much more likely to be supportive of it. I think another thing that Jacob misses is if you just let this thing play out, the amount of diversity that you're losing is huge. And as much as I'm all for evolution playing out some kind of, game of optimization, I also don't want to lose a lot of really valuable perspectives and cultures that have sprung up that have, especially given your point about this rapidly evolving climate. In the past, it made sense because for thousands of years, things wouldn't really change. So of course, it's good to just delete from the genome the stuff that at one point in time isn't fit. Right now, if we delete from the genome something that right now isn't useful, but we're like, the singularity is here and things are about to rapidly go into clown world times, like squared, cubed to infinity. We're making a big mistake. And I think that's another really important point, is that we cannot afford to like miss out on all that diversity. Another really important point, and you and I've looked at this from our nebula genomics sequencing, because actually 2 of the scores that Jacob mentions here are scores that we can see for ourselves in nebula. We can see our scores for age at first birth, which are not really remarkable. So your polygenic score for age at first birth is 42nd. You're in the 42nd percentile. So you're 40% of the average score to have an older age at birth.
Average.
Yeah, meaning you're more likely to be younger with first birth, because this is a polygenic score for people who are more likely to be older when they have their first kid. And I'm in the 29th percentile. So I'm even more likely to have kids young, which actually makes sense given when some of my ancestors had kids. So the more important one is childlessness. More interestingly is the childlessness scores, which I think, one, are accurate for you and me, but also show how genetics aren't everything, how life is about nature and nurture. So your childlessness percentile is 59%, which kind of makes sense. I mean, your family, they're like, yeah, we're definitely having kids, but they cap it at 3.
Well,
they're like,
it's a couple of 4, but yeah, I think that
sometimes 4.
my family is motivated, as I said, to be high fertility through a completely different mechanism than was particularly successful within the last few generations, even though my family has always had lots of kids. Like if you read our family books, it was 12 kids per generation, like 3 generations in a row. So, very high fertility historically, high fertility still. But I think it was a different strategy being used than the one being captured here, but continue.
More importantly, and this checks out, I'm in the 97th percentile for childlessness. So I am among those in the population who, based on my genetics, is way less likely to have kids, any kids at all, which kind of checks out, right? I mean, like, my counterfactual was going to be childlessness. My plan in life before I met you was childlessness. But I think the fact that I met you and that you changed my surroundings and environment and culture, which can happen to anyone, especially based on things like government policy and various incentives, demonstrates just how weak genetic determinism is. Because suddenly, well, not suddenly, like, over years or whatever, but based on external exogenous factors, Jake, I went from wanting 0 kids, in fact, to being really excited about the idea of like sterilizing myself, even though I was a virgin. I was just like, I don't know, just in case. I went to being like, well, I want 5 kids, no, 7 kids, no, 10 kids, no, 14 kids, just like endless
But
desire
I
for children.
think what you're missing here is you see this as an argument against genetic determinism when it's not at all an argument against genetic determinism. It's an argument for genetic determinism. What you are missing is the thing that transformed for you is you internally frame it as I am what changed for you. But that's not really it. It's the culture and worldview, the mimetic framework that I brought worked really, really well to motivate high fertility with the very same impulses that may have motivated a very low fertility rate when these numbers were being calculated. So you, being a person who is not motivated by arousal, being a person who is incredibly deliberate, being a person who really likes setting
all
out
those
numbers
factors.
and goals and hitting your metrics within the last generation and within the framework that most of society is using, this is going to be a very low fertility genetic profile. However, within the techno-Puritan worldview and framework that we hopefully can pass on to our kids, this is the most high profile and high fertility genetic profile you can have, which is again why there is utility in preserving some degree of genetic diversity into the future, because you
don't know what environment they might suddenly thrive in.
Well, and you've got to, and this is why I often tell people, when you're crafting a culture for yourself and your kids, this is why it's so dangerous to just borrow somebody else's culture like lock and barrel, right? Instead of tweaking it for your own proclivities, way of seeing the world, vices, etc. And this techno-Puritan mindset, if you've watched our tracks on this and everything, that's very much about, you do not breed for arousal, you do not do anything for pleasure, you do not, you are doing it for the intergenerational improvement of humanity, for your kids, for your, it is a task. Reframing fertility as a task and a task of value is how I made it conducive with this genetic profile for you.
Yeah, which is still a very compelling argument for people not looking at genetics and thinking this means this is how this person's life is going to play out, and no one should.
No, but they should look at genetics and say, oh, these traits, like your personality, is highly heritable. It is not something that's going to change over the course of your life. So if you want to alter the fertility rate of somebody with this genetic profile that in the existing social context leads to very low fertility rates, what you need to change is the social context and scaffolding that is on top of them, because that is the thing that you can actually change. You cannot change their genetics.
Well, yes. Okay. Rule number 1 is allow for cultural and religious freedom. Let high fertility families do their thing. Rule 2 is, if you want to create a new additional environment that is very conducive to high fertility, look at those factors. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. That is favorable.
All right. I love you, Simone. You are a perfect woman.
Okay. How about?
All right. I have us recording for when you're ready.
Good.
I realized something, Simone.
Yeah.
You are not just post-wall, but you're like 7 years post-wall now.
Is wall exactly 30?
Yeah, I think that's like the common understanding. It's 30 or 32 or the two that I often hear.
Yeah, see, I thought it was, I thought it was 32. That's sort of like what I've anchored to, but who knows? I've been post-wall for my entire life.
Just
I looked very post-wall.
Is irrelevant if you have 4 kids and a 5th on the way.
Well,
I don't think we've announced that yet, have we?
We tweeted the frozen embryo transfer and then subsequently got
we've got a heartbeat
and pneumonia. Yeah, so hopefully the pregnancy won't be lost. We have to see how the next appointment goes, and if everything still looks healthy, then the odds of losing this pregnancy go down to around 2%, which would be ideal. So fingers crossed.
And I wonder if the audience notices when we're doing like backlog content. I've been gone for the past week. For anyone who didn't recognize that all the episodes were evergreen and filmed a while ago.
Evergreen.
I love when people are like, oh, they still got all their Christmas ornaments up. I'm like, no, we don't have Christmas ornaments up. We filmed all of that ages ago. Like, do you think we can film an episode every day? Like, that makes no sense. We have jobs and other things that we're working on.